Hi, I'm Brendan Giles. I'm from Worrells. We're an accounting firm that specialises in turnaround, recovery and insolvency for businesses and individuals. And today we're going to be talking about navigating solvency and risk in the next phase of the economic recovery. So first things, we need to just do a quick disclaimer. Our lawyers require us to do this. I won't read the whole thing, but essentially everything today is general. If you need any specific advice for your specific circumstances, feel free to give us a call, reach out. We're always happy to have a chat. So what we're going to look at today is what's going on right now, so where we are for the business environment, what risks that poses for directors of companies, and then a few tips on how to respond to those risks and make sure that you don't get caught out as things change rapidly over the next 18 to 24 months. And if anyone's got any questions, just jump in. Don't wait to the end. Happy to sort of deal with questions as they pop up. So what's going on right now? We're just going to have a quick look at the business environment right now and what are the main drivers that are leading to change in the business environment and are throwing up risks for business owners. So the big one that's on everyone's lips, the obvious thing, is inflation and interest rates. So inflation is at decade highs at the moment. We've had a long period of really low inflation in Australia and globally, and that's come to an end very abruptly. We had 5.1% inflation last quarter. We're looking at 7 to 8% inflation by the end of the year, and the RBA thinks that it will be 2 to 3 years before inflation gets back down to their target band of 2 to 3%. What that means is rising prices, and rising prices put pressure on everything in a business, and pressure on profit margins, those kind of things. We're going to see the RBA respond to the inflation problem by increasing interest rates. They've already done 2 increases in the last 2 months. We're going to see another 50 basis points increase in next week when the RBA meets. And the market's predicting the cash rate to get to around 3% by the end of this year and peak at around 3.8% in mid-2023. And you can see that starting to flow through to business lending rates and mortgage rates. This morning, CBA increased their 3, 4 and 5 fixed year rates by 150 basis points to over 6.5%. Just this morning, we're seeing business, finance lending rates getting up above 9% now. So those real rates are really moving up quickly, and that puts a lot of stress on businesses that need to find capital to fund their business activities. Rising rates also have an impact on consumers. So every 100 basis point rise in interest rates we see in Australia, we lose 5% of discretionary income for consumers. So it's got less people with less money to spend. We're also seeing supply chain challenges. That little graph is the cost of shipping a container in US dollars, and you can see it's gone from less than $2,000. It's currently hovering around 8, and it's expected to stay there for at least 24 months in that sort of range. There's a couple of drivers for that. There's a global shortage of important things that you need to move stuff around. So mainly containers and container ships. During the early phase of the GFC, a lot of container shipping companies saw a fall in demand and took the opportunity to scrap some of their older, less efficient boats. And it takes a lot of time to rebuild up that capacity. And so there's going to be a shortage there. And then there's also a shortage in containers, with containers stuck on the US side of the Pacific. And there's not as much capacity to bring them back so that they can get reloaded and begin the circle again. And then we've also got the impact of energy costs. So boats use a lot of fuel, and the cost of fuel, as everyone knows, when they hit the petrol bowser, has gone up. And so that adds to the cost of shipping. We've also got other issues with the supply chain in getting stuff made, especially in China. China's continuing their zero COVID policy. Xi Jinping had a speech 2 days ago where he reiterated that that is the best route for China. And so we're going to see continued lockdowns in China, which affect production. And China really is the world's manufacturing hub. And if China can't produce stuff, there's going to be less stuff available for people to buy. Staffing shortages. Got this problem in Australia with super low unemployment. We're at 3.9%, lowest it's been in about 50 years. Participation is also very high, 66.7% off the top of my head, which is one of the highest participation rates we've had in 50 years as well. So we're seeing people who, more people participating in the workforce, and we're still eating up all those jobs. And the main reason is that during COVID, we had 400,000 workers leave Australia, and we haven't replaced them. We've only had about 69,000 people come back since we reopened the borders. And so that's just left a big shortfall. It's hitting some industries harder than others. In particular, we're seeing at the high-skilled worker end, we had a lot of people, leave Australia to go back home to work. And so there's real issues finding high-skilled tradies, engineers, accountants, and lawyers. And that's causing real troubles at that end of the market. And then at the other end of the market, where you have really low-skilled workers, which was those student visa holders who are picking vegetables and picking fruit and working in restaurants, they're not there as well. With the shortage of staff, you've also got a cost problem with staffing because, employees are seeing rising prices through inflation, and they're wanting to chase that cost of living rises with their wages. We're seeing the minimum wage go up 5.1%, and that's causing a lot of pressure as well on businesses. We've had a recent case where we helped a guy essentially restructure his entire business, and that was because he didn't have any capacity to do the work that he was getting in. So he was getting in too much work. He couldn't get staff to do that work, and we had to restructure the whole business around how do we do better work. So we focused on reducing the amount of work he had available and increasing the quality of that work with the staff he could get, because there just wasn't an available staff to fulfill the needs if he kept the same level of clients. Oh, we're going to chat here. Cool. Energy crisis. So we've also seen rising energy prices, the highest they've been in a very long time. That's got a couple of drivers. First is the war in Ukraine. Everyone should be well aware of that. That's caused a shortage worldwide of both oil and gas, and that has flow-on effects to prices everywhere. And you'll have seen the increase in petrol prices, especially in Australia. It's affecting everyone who ever has to fill up a car. That is not going to get better. There's a global shortage of oil. It has been somewhat abated by the fact that China has been in a lockdown, and China road freight and road usage is actually at a relatively low level at the moment. When China gets back to business at some point, and those road freight levels and car use levels get back to normal, China is going to increase its oil needs again, and we're going to see even more pressure on oil and petrol prices. So I wouldn't be expecting any relief at the Bowser. We've also in Australia got petrol excise coming back to the full freight rate in September. The current government has indicated it's not going to extend the holiday on petrol excise, so you're going to see that hit as well. It's an extra sort of 22 cents a litre. Gas, we've also got a problem in Australia with gas. This is mainly caused by our linking of our market to the international market. We don't have a shortage of gas in Australia, so there are mechanisms there that the government can use to fix that problem. But it's going to be an ongoing problem, and we're seeing especially some manufacturing in Australia get really hit as their sort of 60 and 90-day rolling gas price contracts roll over, and suddenly they're paying 3 or 4 times as much for gas. So moving on, we've got falling confidence as another thing that we're seeing. Both consumer and business confidence is at multi-decade lows, excluding the brief period when we went into lockdowns at the start of 2020. You can see on this graph the big spike down there. But since then, and this is the lowest we've had it in a long, long time. Lower confidence means less investment. It means less spending. Especially on the consumer side at the moment, we're seeing a two-speed economy. We're seeing wealthier households who have a lot of savings, they have a lot of equity in their assets. They've got their houses and investment properties have gone up in value. They've maybe got their share portfolios that have got up in value. And so they've got a lot of capacity there to keep spending, and they are continuing to spend. Retail spending is record highs as well, while confidence is low, which is not normally what we see, but it's really being driven by a top end of the market. And then on the other end, with lower wealth households and lower income households, they've really cut back, and they're the ones really seeing the confidence hit. This is going to cause some difficulties for the RBA because it's going to be a lot harder to really stop those wealthier households from spending. But from a business's perspective, it's handy if you can target those wealthier households and target at their, what they want to buy, what they want to do. You're seeing, a lot of high-end restaurants and those kind of things are doing really well at the moment because the people, they've got money, they're not feeling the pressure yet, and they're wanting to go out and spend money. And so there's opportunities there. And finally, are we going to see a recession? I know that's getting talked about in the media at the moment, and I'd say probably in the next 18 months we are. At this point, there's really no way the United States avoids a recession, given the position they're in with inflation out of control. If the Fed's going to get that back under control, they're pretty much going to have to stimulate a recession to get that done. And look, China also has a looming debt crisis, and the longer they continue with their COVID-0 policy and it continues to put pressure on their economy, the more likely that debt crisis will boil over, and we'll see a big downturn in China as well. As our two major trading partners, if the US and China both have issues, there's no way that Australia is going to get out of a recession. And so, businesses need to be preparing now and thinking ahead about what we do if there's a big downturn. How are we going to make up? Can we cut costs? What can we do? And we're going to look at some of those ideas as we work through the next sections. So the risks for directors. You're probably all aware, but we'll just quickly brush on it. Directors and a company have separate dealings. Your company's dealings are not the same as the director's dealings, but there are mechanisms in the Corporations Act and through various legal loopholes, I suppose, that can enable creditors of a company to pierce the corporate veil and start chasing the directors personally. And so as a director of a company, when you're trading your company, you need to be aware of what those risk factors are and making sure you avoid them so that you're protecting your personal assets from anything that goes on in the company. The advantage of a company is that you are protected should things go wrong. So first we're going to look at insolvency because a lot of stuff stems from insolvency. If your company goes insolvent or becomes insolvent, you opens the directors up to a range of claims that can be made against them. So the Corps Act has a fairly simple definition of insolvency, which is a person is solvent if and only if they're able to pay their debts as and when they become due and payable. And if you're not solvent, you're insolvent. It's a lot more complicated than that, and we're going to look through the elements that decide whether a company is insolvent or not. And when we're looking at a company that has failed and looking at making claims at a director, what are the steps we go through to determine whether a company is actually insolvent? And then that gives you guideline as a director of the things you need to look at when you're trading a company to make sure that you don't fall afoul of insolvency. The main reasons you want to do that is, one, it's illegal to trade a company while insolvent, and there are criminal prosecutions available. I have been part of a number of prosecutions where we have sent directors to jail for considerable periods of time for trading their company whilst insolvent. So you can end up in prison for this. You can end up with big fines. There are also civil penalties, so you can be liable for the debts of the company because you allowed the company to trade whilst insolvent. Little bit of legal in-house stuff here. These are the signs of insolvency as set out in a landmark case, ASIC v. Plyman, P-L-Y-M-I-N, if you want to look it up. If you're an insolvency legal nerd like me, you'd find that case very interesting, but generally I think most people don't need to read it. But the court very helpfully set out 13 factors, which are the way signs you go through to look for to determine if a company is insolvent. And we're going to run through those in a sort of high-level way now, so that as you trade your company, you can be on top of what each of these are. And the way it is dealt with by the courts is you're looking at building up a preponderance of evidence. So having just one or two of these is probably not enough to have a company deemed insolvent. But if you've got 10 out of the 13, you're definitely going to be, falling over that line. And it depends a bit on how bad they are. So stepping through them, first we've got continuing losses. This one's very easy to understand. As a business owner, you're running your business. You should be preparing, financial statements on a regular basis. Or if you're not, you can go into your Xero or your NIRB and you can pull up a profit and loss statement relatively easily. And that'll show you at the bottom a net profit or net loss position. It doesn't making losses is not an indicator of insolvency on its own. If you've got a way to fund losses and be able to continue trading despite those losses and continue paying your debts, you're not going to be at risk of being insolvent. And we see that a lot with startups. We've done a lot of work with VC-backed startups recently that have the money has dried up on. And so through the period where they've been trading, they've been making losses their entire trading period, but they've never been insolvent because they've had a venture capital backer there just putting more working capital in over time. But as soon as that venture capital backer lost access to funds and therefore no longer has the ability to back that company, those losses now become unsustainable, and it tips over that threshold to now be potentially insolvent, and it becomes a risk for the directors, and they need to start looking at winding that company up or taking steps to protect themselves. And you can see here breakdown of liquidity for a company. I'm not going to go through this. I just put these in the slides. So there's sort of a example that people can look at, and you've got your current ratios, and we'll look at some ratios a bit later. Overdue Commonwealth and State taxes. In Australia, it is a very common thing for businesses that are struggling to use the Australian Taxation Office as a lender of last resort, essentially. So I will borrow money from the ATO by not remitting the PAYG and the super that I'm withholding from my employees, and the GST that I'm withholding from collecting from my customers and withholding from the ATO. I don't remit that to the ATO straight away. I keep it. And I use that to fund my business. And so I'm essentially using the ATO as a bank. It is a very expensive form of finance, but it's an easy form of finance. You don't have to do an application. The ATO are pretty slow at chasing things up. So you get some time there to try and get yourself back on your feet. The problem with that is the ATO also has a lot of powers to pursue debts. And through the COVID pandemic period, the ATO really stepped back and didn't actively pursue debts and didn't even actively sort of remind businesses that they had outstanding debts. And we're seeing a lot of businesses now that have got themselves in trouble because they've got these accrued tax debts. Business conditions are starting to deteriorate, and so they're losing the ability to repay those accrued tax debts, and it's going to be causing a lot of problems. The ATO also has a bunch of additional powers that it can use to make directors liable that we're going to look at outside of this discussion about insolvency. We'll look at that a bit later, because you need to be aware of those powers that it has too, because there are certain triggers that the ATO has, and if you trip those triggers, they can just come straight for you as a director. They don't have to worry about going through and proving insolvency and making an insolvent trading claim or something like that. They can just directly go. Poor relationships with the bank. So this usually stems from either you can't pay monies to the bank, you're regularly getting transactions dishonoured. The court case in this case is quite old and had a lot to do with dishonoured checks and checks bouncing and issuing checks post-dated, which doesn't happen in the world anymore. Everyone uses EFTs, but we still see the same thing happening with EFTs. As businesses get into trouble, suppliers start chasing, they'll start doing EFT transactions to say, hey, I've transferred you the money. That transaction then bounces because there's no money available. And then, that's a sign. It's essentially like a dishonoured check. In the old days where you'd send the check. It's just now it's done by an EFT. It happens in 24 hours instead of over a couple of days. You'll also see issues where banks will withdraw support for a business. That can be closing an overdraft or capping overdrafts, sending letters demanding you need to pay down your debt by certain amounts. You might have, say, a $10 million facility and we require it to be reduced to an $8 million by this date and a $6 million by this date, things like that. So there'll be banks starting to turn the screws on. We saw a lot of this during the GFC. As things got tighter, the bank's risk profile started to change and they started to look at, there's this portion at the sort of limit of our portfolio that we now consider too risky given the way the economy is going. And so now we're going to step in and start taking steps to reduce that part of our risk. And I think we'll see that again as economic times get more difficult. The banks are going to start looking to trim risk off the extremities of their debt books, especially in small businesses where there's a lot of not really high quality loans. We saw the GFC really caused by subprime, which is low quality lending to mortgages, to individuals for mortgages, and the banks moved away from that. But since then, they've really moved to a lot of subprime business lending to keep growing, and some of that subprime business lending is really going to need to be reined in, and it's going to get into delinquency as business conditions deteriorate. From a practical perspective, you should be talking to your banker, keeping on top of your relationship with them. They're important, especially if you've got large loans, if you're a developer, if you need continual working capital financing to keep your business going. That's a very important relationship and one that you need to be managing actively. No access to alternative finance. This is a key, real key indicator for insolvency, because insolvency is really a cash flow test. And you can have a business that's in a lot of trouble, it's making losses, it's got issues meeting its debts, it's got some taxes problems, but if it hasn't access to external financing that can keep it going, then it's not going to be insolvent. And often we see this with small businesses. It's the business owner putting money in, mortgaging their house, selling their house, selling other assets, putting that money in to keep the business afloat. We'll talk a bit more later about how, if you're going to do that, you should be doing it, because you need to protect yourself as a director if you're going to be putting money in. And it's not always the best solution, but I think we'll see, we're going to see a lot of that because asset prices have gone up. People now have equity in their houses that they can jump on and use. And so that's another way to temporarily get over a short-term cash crisis and avoid being insolvent during that period. but it's not a long-term solution because you don't have infinite access to finance. And if you're going to take the option of bringing in alternative money, bringing in external money, you need to have a real plan of what we're doing. We're bringing that money for these particular reasons, and here's the process we're going to use to make sure we can get it back out. Suppliers placing the companies on cash on delivery. We see this a lot as businesses get in trouble. They have trouble paying their creditors. We're seeing a huge amount of this at the moment in the construction space, where construction companies are really getting pinched on their margins. There was a lot of competition in the construction space before we got into the current sort of price increase cycle, and that had really whittled down margins in the construction sector. And so now we've had a bunch of supply increases in costs. There's no margin in a lot of these construction projects, but they feel they have to do them because otherwise they don't have a business. But you're having trouble, paying your suppliers as you go because you've got to find extra finance every cycle you go through with your progress payments. And so suppliers, know this is a problem, and they're seeing the risk in the marketplace. We've seen some big failures already where suppliers have got burned, and so they're just putting people on cash on delivery. So they're saying, we're not going to extend credit to you anymore. We're going to put you on cash on delivery. And it's not a strong indicator of insolvency. There can be good reasons why you want to put someone on cash on delivery, but if a bunch of suppliers have been worried enough that they don't want to issue credit to a company anymore, it is another indicator. Okay, so if you're there, your business is trading along and you're seeing this happen, from some of the suppliers, it's a warning sign. We're back on talking about old technology with checks, but we are seeing this a little bit with deferred or delayed EFTs. So you'll see people going to their bank, they'll tell their supplier, look, I'll pay you on Friday, I'll set up the EFT now, with a delay on it. Usually it'll be a rounded amount, not for the full debt because you can't pay the full amount. And then you're setting it up, you're sending them a screenshot or something to show them that I've set up the payment and it'll go in on Friday or later in the week. Look, I think as a director at any point, if you're having trouble paying your creditors on a regular basis and over a long period of time, if it's a short-term cash flow crisis, you can understand. But if this becomes a genuine thing where you're scratching around trying to find money and you're having to delay payments and things, then that's a serious indicator that you've got significant solvency issues and you need to start taking steps about that. Dishonored checks. We don't see dishonored checks very much anymore because people don't use them, but we do see dishonored EFTs. It's becoming a big thing where they'll transfer the money. It pops up in the receiver's bank account. They get it. They're happy. They're on the phone. They go, okay, we'll release the next order or whatever. And then, 12 hours later, it bounces. And there's lack of sufficient funds there. But it is a way that directors use to get, another supply, try and keep themselves going. Obviously, if you're at the point where you're transacting and your EFTs are bouncing, you've got serious problems. I don't think you need any reasonable director can say that their business is doing well if they're having those kind of issues, and it's a serious red flag. Special creditor arrangements and rounded sums like this is something a lot of business owners you talk to think it's sort of just a reasonable, normal thing. You're entering into a payment arrangement. You see this a lot with the ATO lately where they'll enter into repayment arrangements, and some of them are frankly ridiculous. We had a payment arrangement, it was a couple of months ago now, where the ATO had entered into a $5,000 a month payment arrangement for a company that had an average monthly BAS close to 50 grand. So they're adding 45 grand debt every month, even if they stick to the payment arrangement. That's clearly not a reasonable payment arrangement, and it's a clear indicator that that company is insolvent or likely to be insolvent very soon, can't even pay its ongoing debts. But you also see it with suppliers. Company gets a bit behind, director thinks it's very reasonable, rather than pay the full invoices, I'll pay you 5 now, 5 next week, when I get the money. But that is a real red flag for insolvency, and it's a problem that directors overlook because it feels like just a normal business accommodation to try and get debts paid and keep the business going. But it will come back to bite you if things do continue to deteriorate. And so it's something to be aware of as you're running your business and just stay on top of. Very obvious one, you're getting demands, summons, judgments, or warrants. So this is legal proceedings that have been issued against you chasing debts. If that's happening, you clearly have an insolvency problem and you're at high risk at that point, and you need to start taking steps to do something about it. At that point, it's really, you need to get your lawyers and your advisors involved. Inability to produce timely and accurate financial information. So Section 286 of the Act provides a duty on directors to maintain financial records that enable fair and accurate financial statements to be prepared for a company. And they need to be available at all times. So initially, it's an offence to not maintain those records. So if your company fails and you don't have records maintained, ASIC, upon the recommendation of a liquidator, will normally take steps to pursue a director for that failure. It's usually a fine. It can, depending on the size of the company, it can be quite a big fine. I've seen people get $15,000 and $20,000 fines for not keeping their books and records up to date. It technically can be up to 6 months in jail, but I've never seen anyone go to prison for it. But it's also important because if you don't keep accurate financial information and you're not staying on top of getting your records up to date, keeping them up to date, making sure you've got enough information in your accounting system to know what's going on, you can't really manage your business properly because you don't know what your business is doing or where it's up to. We often, almost every instance when you have a company fail, the records have issues. They haven't been properly maintained, and the directors haven't stayed on top of those records. And often a contributing factor to the failure of the business is they didn't know what was going on. They didn't know who they owed money to exactly. They didn't know who their debtors were and what the debtor days were, so they weren't pursuing them when they could. And that's, you're sort of trying to run your business with a blindfold on. And if you are getting in a situation where your business is under stress, you really need the best information available. And if you go and see an advisor like us, the better information we have, the easier it is to work out a strategy to try and save or turn around a business. Again, if we're trying to act in the dark, it's very difficult. So if you do have, if you have got behind on your records, it's important to get up to date because you've got both the insolvency risk, you've got the risk that you don't know what's going on, you can't manage your business properly, and you've got your Section 286 risk of getting fines and potentially jail time if you don't take care of that. So it's sort of a triple whammy one that you really should be on top of. So what are the risks when, if your company is found to be insolvent? So if your company is insolvent and it fails, that is a liquidator or is appointed, and if your company is insolvent for any length of time, at some point somebody is going to step in and wind that company up if you don't do it yourself. Often it's the ATO who steps in and does that. They've been very quiet, but over the last sort of 2 years, they've been very quiet as part of their helping businesses through COVID. But pre that, the ATO would do 250 to 300 wind-ups a month, and they were a big driver in that space. And also a lot of the institutional creditors would step in and wind up companies if they weren't paying their debts, things like workers' comp, the utility companies. All those guys starting to do that process again. And so if your company is insolvent for any length of time, there's a good chance that at some point it's going to end up in liquidation. And then once it does end up in liquidation, you're exposed to a whole bunch of risks, including insolvent trading, which is probably the worst option available. So there's two, we briefly touched on it before, there's two elements to insolvent trading. First is the criminal element. It's an illegal act. You can go to jail for a very long time for trading whilst insolvent. It really depends on the size of the company, how long you go to jail. So the directors from HIH, if anyone remembers the big HIH failure, they spent a long time in jail, 6 and 7 years. We've had more recent ones where smaller companies, 18 months. We had one got 8 months. So those, it's a significant amount of time if you dishonestly trade whilst insolvent. But the other big risk is you have a civil penalty available. So from the date a company becomes insolvent, the director can be held personally liable for any debts the company incurs. And so what can happen is you're trading your company, you start to see some of these risk factors, you don't take action. Your company is then deemed to be insolvent from a date, and when the liquidator is appointed, they will work out a date based on essentially a matrix analysis of those different factors. And so there'll be a point where maybe we have 6 or 7 factors, a couple of them are really bad, and we draw a line in the sand there and say after that, any trading after that, the director is now personally liable for any debts that are incurred during that period. We are seeing a lot of this happening because during COVID, people traded their businesses on. Revenue was down. They were getting some money from the government, but it wasn't enough. They got behind on their taxes. They weren't paying their rent. And so they started to accrue a bunch of these risk factors that we've looked at. And they tipped over the point sometime during 2020. It's now 2022. They've been trading through this whole period whilst insolvent. And we've seen they've accrued tax debts, they've done deals with suppliers, they've borrowed money, they've got super outstanding to their employees. And when that company falls over, the liquidator now has to turn around and say, well, look, all that money that you incurred while you're a director through that whole period, you're now personally liable for. We're going to have to turn around and take action to recover that from you. Obviously, that's not good if you're a director, and it's something that not enough directors are aware of as a risk. There are things we can do to mitigate that risk, and we're going to talk about them now, but you need to be aware of it and taking steps to be on top of it. Quick comment about financial statement analysis and just how important it is to be on top of your financial statements. You should really, even in a very small business, it's very quick and easy to stay on top of getting your data into your Xero or your MYOB or your QuickBooks. You can have it all come in from the bank. You can set up rules, so it's a lot of it's automatically allocated. So it can be very quick and easy and not take a lot of time to have a really good set of accounts that can give you some really good preliminary balance sheets and income profit loss statements. And then you need to be going through them and looking at, in Xero and MYOB, you can do one where it looks over the last 6 periods. And so you can start to see trends. And you want to look at things like, have I got my cash position? Is it going down? How's my working capital looking? If I got, if my receivables are going up or my inventories are going up, we've seen a real big problem with inventories in a lot of businesses, retail businesses. They've run up inventories and they've got a lot of inventory sitting there, and it's really hurting their working capital because they've got all this money sitting in inventory that they need to sort of do something about. And you can just see it when you look at those 6-month graphs, 6-month periodic balance sheets. Same with, income statements. If you're starting to see sales go down or certain expenses go up, you can start noticing those trends early and taking steps to do something about them. Again, I'm not going to talk about these because I've still got a bunch of stuff to go through and we're running out of time. But it's also good to just run some quick ratio analysis on your financial statements on a regular basis. Do it quarterly at least, and just look at, is your current ratio, are you keeping it above 1? Is it not deteriorating? Same with your quick and cash ratios. Just make sure you calculate them. They should all be above 1, and they should all be steady at least. If they're starting to decline, that's a worry and something you need to be looking at and seeing, 1, why, and 2, what we can do to stop that decline. Some furthers, we've got our solvency ratios, which come in as percentages. And again, it's not so much about the number, it's about doing them over time and looking at the trends. Are we seeing our debt to asset ratio go up? If so, why? Is there a good reason? Are we seeing our interest coverage ratio go down? And if so, is there a good reason? If not, can we do something about it? So we've got here a bunch of them and just a little explanation about how you can use them. Some other risks we need to look at that often go overlooked. And the first one is personal guarantees. So it's a promise. A personal guarantee is a written promise by one person to guarantee the liability of other. And we'll see almost every supply agreement you sign as a company director, as a business owner, will have a personal guarantee hidden in it somewhere. Most loan agreements you sign will have a personal guarantee hidden in it somewhere. Not always, but most of them. And in my experience, almost no one understands that they've signed these things. And what they mean is if your company gets into trouble and you can't pay your suppliers, you can't pay the car loan that you took out through your business to get a nice new dual cab ute, you've now got to pay that, even though your company hasn't got the money. You've got to find the money yourself. And so it's important to, one, be aware of these things and don't just give them out willy-nilly. I've run a couple of other small businesses in my time. I had a group of vet practices I operated in that time. I never gave out a personal guarantee. I amended every supplier agreement I got and took out the personal guarantees. I know I've assisted a whole bunch of businesses with renegotiating with their suppliers to get rid of personal guarantees. You don't have to give them, and a lot of suppliers are very open to discussion around taking out those personal guarantees if you can give them other types of security, like PPSA registrations and things, to give them comfort. And so be aware about them. And then first, if you can avoid them, avoid them. You can't always avoid them. But if you can't, make sure you have a register. You keep a register of what personal guarantees you've signed and have an idea of how much is outstanding under those personal guarantees, because you might, if you've got a company, it's not doing well, you're struggling, it's maybe heading towards failure. You want to look at maybe dealing with the creditors that you have personal guarantees with first, because they're the ones that put a risk on you. And so there can be strategies there to use where you start, if we've got the money to pay down some of these, we'll look at paying the ones with personal guarantees first. And there's just a quick summary of what I just said. Next, I mentioned before with the ATO, as well as the insolvency piece, they have their own powers where they can issue notices directly to a director and make them personally liable for not the tax, but a penalty equal to the company's unpaid tax debt if it's overdue. The director essentially becomes liable automatically when a debt becomes overdue, but you don't actually have to pay that liability unless the ATO issues what's called a director penalty notice. And so you'll get a letter in the mail from the ATO saying that they're issuing a director penalty notice and you're now liable as the director for the company's, for the amount equal to the company's tax debt. The ATO was really starting to ramp up these. They issued 60-something thousand director penalty notice warning letters in the last 6 weeks now. And they're issuing 30 to 40 DPNs every day. And they've got about 80,000 more companies that they've said they'll be issuing DPN warning letters to, and then following up with DPNs if compliance isn't achieved, if the debts aren't paid. There are two types of DPNs, and it's important to be aware of the two types. A non-lockdown DPN is issued when a company's lodged its BAS or its income installment activity statement within 3 months after the due date, or you've lodged your SGC statements within 1 month and 28 days after the end of the quarter and have not paid the debt. So you've lodged within 3 months of due date, or 1 month and 28 days for SGC, and not paid. You'll get a non-lockdown DPN, and we're going to call them the good ones. And if you haven't lodged within those time periods, so your BAS or your IAS is more than 3 months late, or your SGC statements are more than 1 month and 28 days late, you'll get a lockdown DPN. A lockdown DPN is the bad kind, and we'll look at them now. So the reason they're good and bad is if you get a non-lockdown DPN, you can do something about it. So it's a letter, it comes to you, it says you're liable if you don't take certain actions within 21 days, you as the director become personally liable for the debt. And there's 4 options available. You can pay the money, you can put the company into administration, you can appoint a small business restructuring practitioner to restructure the business for you, or you can put the company into liquidation and wind it up. And you get 21 days to do any of those things. If you do any of those things, you're now no longer personally liable. You're let off the hook as a director. So there's a way out. If you get a lockdown DPN, the only way out is to pay the penalty. You can also seek relief under one of the statutory defences, and statutory defences are essentially I was too ill to do anything. That's the only real practical one. And you have to go to court to defend that. So even if you have a situation where you've got a statutory defence, it's going to cost you a lot of money to get out of it. But realistically, most lockdown DPNs that are received by people, they either pay the money or they go bankrupt because they're the only real two ways out. So the lesson with DPNs and tax in general is lodge everything even if you can't pay. As long as you lodge on time, and if you can't pay, you can't pay. It is what it is. But if you lodge on time, then the worst you can get is a non-lockdown DPN for the unpaid debt, and then you can deal with it. There's a bunch of options there. And not all those are even terminal to the company. The appointment of an administrator or appointing a small business restructuring practitioner to restructure a company is not meant to be a terminal appointment. Sometimes you can't find a solution. But normally, what happens there is we negotiate with the ATO, we find a solution with the ATO, and we the company continues on with the tax debt restructuring. Quick look at some strategies in the next sort of 5-10 minutes, and how we can deal with some of the risk that's being seen in the business environment. And first I'll say don't do this. This is one of my favorite cartoons ever, where profits and sales and everything are falling, and what if we don't change at all and something magical just happens? I see probably 3 clients a week who have this attitude. It will all be magically fine one day. It'll happen. It'll all be good. We'll just keep doing what we're doing. So the first, I think, important thing is don't be afraid to seek help. You're a business owner, you've got some issues, you're having some trouble, ask for help. Accountants, you can go talk to your accountant, you can talk to business coaches, you can talk to peers in the business community. Something like Growth Gen is a great opportunity where you've got some struggles. You can come to a group of people who've all run businesses. They've all been at the coalface. They've probably, there's going to be some people in the group who've had the same problems you've had. And you can ask them, what did they do? What are some strategies that work for you? You don't have to do everything on your own. We're banging the drum on this a lot. At Worrells, it's one of the things we really talk about is, it's always better to talk to a professional advisor earlier The more options, the earlier you do something, the more options you have, because there's just more time and more resources available. If you come to us and the ATO has already issued a DPN and there's 15 days left or something on the DPN, there's not a lot you can do because just the time is gone. But if you come with 6 months of runway left, there's a lot of opportunity there for advise your accountant or your business coach or your turnaround professional to give advice and come up with a strategy that we can use to turn the business around, find a solution. Went on too far. Second, monitor your business. You really need to understand how your business works. Very, very funny story that I always like to relate is many years ago during the GFC, I was working for a firm. We were appointed to Lehman Brothers, the big investment bank that fell over. We sat down in a meeting with the managers from Lehman Brothers and asked them to explain to us how their big complicated derivatives trading business worked. And none of them could tell us how this thing worked. All they knew is they put sort of numbers in and they got bigger numbers back and it all made money. And but they couldn't explain how most of these contracts and things worked. So even huge businesses like Lehman Brothers, one of the biggest investment banks at the time, don't always know how their business works. And so it's really important to spend some time, whether it's sitting down on your own, sitting down with your key employees, if you're a big enough business to have key employees, or, if you're a sole director running a smaller business, get some face time with your accountant, sit down with them and just go through and make sure you really understand how your business works. Where's the money come from? What are the costs that we have to make that money? What's our key customer, and how do we get in front of them? And so all the steps, all the steps you need to go through to make your business work. And then you can start looking at, where's the pain points along that road? And start looking at, okay, if things are going wrong, where along this process are they going wrong? Which steps can we sort of focus on to turn things around? Current information is key. Good decisions are made based on solid data and current data. There's no good knowing what happened 6 months ago when you've got a problem now. Take your time to really sit down and think through the data. I know, like a lot of business owners, they're really busy. They've got their family, they've got their business. They're trying to actually do the thing that they're good at. They're building widgets or installing doors or whatever it is, and they don't feel like they've got the time to stop and think about their business. But you need to. You need to stop. You need to sit down. You need to look at your data. You need to think about it. Think about what it means, because the obvious solution is not always the best. We had, I sort of mentioned it before, but we had a recent client we worked with, and his big problem was he's running a business. He's got too many clients. Business is booming. He can't service all his clients. He's having issues with his clients because he's not getting to them. He's not providing a standard of service. He's trying to hire more staff. His big thing is, I got to get more staff, and he's been running around doing all this stuff to try and get more staff, and he just can't get good people. The substandard staff he's hiring are not helping solve the problem that he's got. And then he also has a problem where some of his suppliers have gone up dramatically in price recently, and so he's losing money on a lot of this business he's doing as well. So he's super busy. He's not making any money, and he's not really getting the client satisfaction anymore because he doesn't have the staff to stay on top of this. And he came to us wanting solutions for cutting costs and how he can find better staff. And we sat down and we went through this process. We looked at the business. We looked at what are the drivers? How's the business work? We talked through, looked through the data, and we said to him, "You've asked us the wrong questions. The problem you've got is your price is wrong. It's got nothing to do with, you've got enough staff. You've got 4 really good staff. They really know the customers. Everyone loves them. They know exactly how your business works. Every time you bring in someone new, it messes things up. Let's just stick with the 4 really good staff you've got. And we don't need to cut costs. We just need to put your price up." And so we went through a process of modeling his pricing and determining a new price for some of the services. and that's been implemented. It's been running for 6 weeks now, and he's seen a 72%. He's only seeing 72% of the work that he was seeing before, so he's lost 28% of his customers due to the higher price. But he now has enough, the right amount of work for the staff he's got. Customer satisfaction is up because they've got those really good staff running all the clients now. He doesn't have any of the mediocre ones. And his profitability is up because now all of the contracts are now profitable again because he's put his price up. So we've solved the problem by looking at it from a different perspective. And that's important to understand. If you just look at the high level thing, you'll be stuck chasing cost cutting. When really the solution is pricing. Have a plan. I could do a whole multi-hour presentation on strategic planning, so I'm not going to talk about it now. But it's important to have a plan. It needs to be written down. It needs to have be broken down over a period. So what are we doing this quarter? What are we doing next 6 months, this year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? You need to have a plan there. You need to know where you're going. And then you need to be sitting down with your key members of the team, reviewing that plan, and looking to make sure that you adjust it whenever you need to, especially when you get into a situation like we're heading into where the business environment is likely to be a lot more changeable. We're going to see a lot more change. We're going to see things moving. We're going to see a lot more challenges. And so you need that plan. You need to review it and adjust it based on the environment you're in. And finally, protect your investment. We see a lot of people not protecting the investment they have in their business. So when you start a business, you're usually borrowing money yourself and you're putting it into the business. And you need to secure that investment to make sure that you get paid back first if that business fails. You don't want to be an unsecured creditor who gets lumped in with all the other creditors. You want to be at the front of the queue. And the way you do that is by getting a general security agreement prepared. So that is an agreement between you as the shareholder and the director and the company, where the company says that I guarantee and I give you security over all of my assets and undertakings for your investment you've put in. And then you need to register that investment and that security agreement on the personal property security register. So you need to get that register in place. Getting a GSA drafted up and in place and doing a PPS registration are not expensive activities. I know there are some websites. Creditor is one of them, where you can go on there. They'll do all the documents for you. They'll do the registration for you. And it's a very low couple $100 fee to get it done. And it's the same if your business has been struggling. You want to put, it's a good business. We're seeing this a lot now. You just want to put some money in to pay off the COVID debt so that the business can keep going. And it's important, if you're going to put money in, that you go through this process of getting security and making sure that you're first in the queue if anything goes wrong later on.